What is up, my homies? Once again, we have got Levon Aronian and playing Hikaru Nakamura in the St. Louis Showdown game number 2. Today, we had Aronian playing white against Nakamura playing black. Yesterday, Nakamura triumphed over Aronian, and today, let's see what happened. In this game, we have an English opening soon turned to a Catalan Queen's Gambit kind of system. And then actually here's the critical moment when black can decide to mess up. C6 is known to be extremely solid, but the accepted version is quite acceptable for black. No pun not intended. And usually white is playing the queen out to c2 in this position when a6 is pretty much leading to this most popular line ever to be played in the Catalan opening. So, and lately black has been doing okay in the line. So in this game, white chose another move. I know that knight a3 is a move. Queen c2 is probably the overwhelmingly played move, but knight e5 was played in this game. I actually do play this line for white occasionally. I think it's pretty good for white actually. The idea is that the normal move c5 is knight by d takes c5, and this kind of position is preferable for white, but I guess black is doing fine, but the bad bishop is pretty bad in this kind of position, so that's what white's idea in that kind of position is. c5 is one move, but knight c6 is the other move. I don't really know what else you're going to do really in this position. Knight d7 is probably just running into knight takes c4, and it's not really clear what this knight is doing. c5 is, I think, probably just met by bishop, maybe knight c3, or maybe even bishop f4. Looks quite okay for white in any case. Yeah, it looks really okay. So knight c6 is one move, and the idea is that usually white is actually not capturing with the knight, hoping for this structure, because black is getting pretty good pressure along this pawn right here. Even if you get the pawn right here, and even if you get this one, I mean, black is really obtaining good pressure on the pawn here in d4. A move like e3 is always weakening this light square diagonal that the bishop might come along. So I guess that's kind of the logic. I don't know too much of the theory of knight takes c6. I'm more familiar with bishop takes c6 and the ideas behind it. And this kind of position is the position type you get with opposite colored bishops in this position. So usually in this position, when I have it on the board, I usually play queen c2 or I think it's knight c3 or something. I completely forget everything. But in this position, we have a, let's see if I can find the game again. Wow, I just lost the PGM. How embarrassing of me. Here we go. Takes, 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 takes. And in this game, Aronian played knight a3, a pretty interesting deviation, and Nakamura pretty much opens up the center really fast with c5, and the idea is to pretty much alleviate all the tension in the center really quickly to make sure black is not left with this weak pawn on the c7 square right over here. c5 takes, queen takes, and now bishop e3 gaining tempo on the queen. Queen b4. Nakamura actually thought for like 30 minutes in this position. A bit surprising, but I guess he just wants to make sure nothing's going wrong at all. And queen b4 was played by Nakamura, and queen c1 was designed to pretty much gain a lot of pressure on the pawn right here. And after bishop h6, bishop d4 was played to get some pressure on that knight. Look at d8. White can certainly capture the knight here, but I think in this kind of position you don't really want to. You always want to kind of keep this bishop. This bishop's really nice as a long-term asset, I guess, and we'll see in the game why it does become that kind of piece. Rook d1 was played. Bishop c3 was certainly possible, but I guess he doesn't want to give the queen this nice long diagonal there. Rook a c8 to support the pawn. And now Aronian played queen c3, pretty much trading off into a queenless middle game. In this position, Nakamura certainly could have taken here on c3 with his queen, and after this, I think probably white would capture with the b pawn, knight d5. I don't know, probably rook a b1. This kind of position would happen where white is pretty much slightly better because he's got the extra pawn, but black has good activity with this rook right over here. So black is not doing badly at all there, I think. That's the one kind of position type we could have gotten. But instead, Nakamura played queen a4 in this position, avoiding the queen trade. But the thing is that after Aronian's next move, the idea is that white is really going to threaten capturing this pawn right over here, followed by perhaps a rook trade when, worst case scenario, he's getting a bishop and queen versus queen and knight kind of middle game, end game thing where white is definitely to be preferred in that kind of position. Now that white has everything developed properly, a move like queen c6 totally normal is probably running into just the captures, takes, queen c3, attacking the f6 pawn, and e5 probably has to be played. But this is really, really nice for white, who can really shift his queen over here and try to apply pressure from the pawn with the queen laterally. There's a lot of pressure on that pawn. So black really doesn't want to allow the doubling of the pawns right now, since white's now all developed. Instead, we saw queen takes c2. We saw a queen trade, and pretty much the game doesn't look that great at first, you'd think, but c3 was played by Nakamura to get rid of this pawn that's always touching this bishop, and the bishop really wants to activate itself on here. So that makes a lot of sense. Bishop takes, rook takes first, and now we get an equal material pawn trade there. Rook e1, bishop c4. And yeah, in this position, Aronian played knight e3 and attacks this bishop right over here. Here, Nakamura could have really easily drawn the game with bishop takes a2, and I think after this, rook a1 followed by rook takes a7 is pretty much leading to a dead kind of draw almost. Sure, white has the pass pawn and really can never be worse, but I mean, this position's totally fine for black. I think this would have been really satisfactory, I think. But in this position, Nakamura makes another interesting move with knight takes knight d4, and well, naturally Aronian captured the bishop right over here, seeing that this bishop's really nicely placed. And rook takes here happened. Now bishop d2 to pretty much play rook c1 and try to trade off this rook. Here, the engines say it's 0.000, and to be honest, I don't agree with this kind of evaluation. Practically speaking, if we kind of reach a bishop and knight endgame, it might be drawn really, but the thing is, the positions can get critical fast, where the side like white has many options to make moves in general, but then eventually black often gets pushed back in these kind of positions. We'll see what I mean. King f8 to activate the king, rook c1, and we saw a rook trade. Now king e7 further activating his king. Both sides are concerned with taking a little bit of space of their own. Nakamura places this knight and pawn in a nice configuration where the king can never really move forward in this kind of position. The king can never get to the square either too. So we've got a little bit of a shield here with the pawn and knight right here. But the thing is, after king d2, f5, king c2, check, here, bishop e3, really, really nice bishop, by the way, to protect the pawn right here, and this is just a really nice configuration. a6, further getting one more pawn off the wide square, dark square I mean. King c3, king d6, h4, and now g6. This position's, you'd be surprised, even though it's like objectively equal by the engine, when you're playing this over the board, it does not feel comfortable if you're black about this position. The thing is, even though we all like the knights, I'm sorry for you knight fanatics, that this position is practically uncomfortable for black to play, in my opinion. The idea is that white has a 2-1-1 majority, can advance the pawns right over here, and it's difficult for black to move his majority given that the bishop is controlling all of these squares. You'd have to bring the king to one of these squares on f6 or g7 to really make progress to push the pawns just to get it going, and that takes a while to get over there. If you bring the king over here, then you're in danger of losing this pawn right over here if you're not careful. So after b4, we saw white start his majority, and really in this position, I mean, like I said earlier, the positions can get critical really fast. The side with the bishop has a lot more moves to waste without changing the position too much. Well, if you move the knight away, it tends to be that this knight has to stay on a certain square often to control certain factors in the position. So the idea is that this knight has to always remain here to protect the c5 and e5 and b2 and e1. A lot of these squares are pretty critical. Maybe not these two, but b2, c5, and e5, f4, b4. These are all critical squares, but if you're like a bishop, you can always kind of stay in contact with these squares often. You can easily get back to them. There's only one square that the knight can do to get to these squares, while the bishop can often go to these constantly, and it's not so easy. Anyways, that's a bit of a digression, but after king d5, I think this is a slight mistake by Nakamura. He's going off in the wrong track. He should probably play king c6 in this position, controlling this b5 square. And after this, I think white would probably play f3, undermining the point here. It's not really clear if this is the best move. Perhaps a4 was also an alternative here in this position. Certainly not that bad, but to prevent king b5. But even after king b5 takes, this kind of position is certainly fine for black. I think also, if I recall correctly, after the captures here, what black can probably take here, threatening the capture over here. And this is not really a problem for black. This is probably the best try for black to really draw the game. I think he's doing okay in that line. But in the game, we saw king d5, and after this, white gets to play a4, and really Nakamura, some bells should be lighting up in his forehead. If we see the pawn go to this square, we see that the pawn is controlling that square, the bishop is controlling that square, the king is controlling this square. We've got this whole thing covered, and the black king is going to be shut out if we allow b5. So the first move that should really pop in your mind is king c6, and this is what Nakamura should play. And after this, I think white would still continue with this kind of plan. And I think black should be okay in this position. Although really, it's still annoying to play, given that white is going to create the pass pawn if you play king b5 in this kind of position. This is still very annoying to play if you are black. So in the game, we saw black actually play, instead of king c6, he actually decided to bring the knight back. And the problem is, now white plays b5. And, this is an extremely tough pawn to stop. I mean, if he captures, and, I don't know, knight d3, we can already see that white is going to make some really nice progress in this kind of position to help support the pawn. A move like king d6 can eventually be just met by like a king c4 perhaps, or maybe just the same plan. And one idea is that once you force the king back here and you have this pawn on b6, then you can finally shift over your king via the light squares to attack the black kingside pawns. This is the strength of having a pass pawn, so you can deflect the black king. Black is in serious trouble here. So in this position, instead of a-taking, he just decided to play a5, and we saw the natural move bishop b6 attacking the pawn come, and after knight c4 we saw a really, really nice, interesting idea with bishop d8, always attacking the pawn, and you can't really move the knight because it's always stuck there, so you've got to move the king to defend the knight, and there's only one more square to do that, king c5, and Aronian found a nice theme with bishop c7, preventing the king from accessing these squares, preventing the knight from moving to any of these squares. So one idea is that if you play knight b6, you're getting into a lost king and pawn endgame, where the king comes over here and scoops up all the pawns right over here. No chance for black to survive that. Black can never, of course, get to this pawn like he wants to without allowing this pawn to come out. So that's a win for white. And, it's extremely uncomfortable for black to move in this position. In this position, Nakamura played h5. I think this position's already really bad. I mean, it's probably even lost in this kind of position. Allowing white to get this kind of formation is pretty much asking for it when you've got a bishop like this on the board. Turns out the bishop is just a stronger piece. Instead of h5, he could also play h6 instead from that. After this, I think white would play bishop f4, and I don't know. I mean, you might get the same position, but with the bishop on c7, it's even worse then. So, I mean, g5 is the only move that makes sense to trade off this pawn, but I mean, you're down a pawn for little to nothing in compensation, and I mean, your position doesn't get any better. So the bishop definitely has more options in this kind of position. So h5 is certainly interesting, but it just doesn't work out. King c2 is pretty much a waiting move by Aronian to make progress in this position. Notice that you can't really step away with the king to a square like this because b6 comes and the pawn is promoting this kind of position. So your king always has to stay close to the pawn right over here. So his next move kind of makes some sense. King d5. He can't really move the knight again because I guess maybe knight b6 is possible, but it doesn't really make much sense in this kind of position. I guess probably king b3, right? And maybe we get this position with black to move. Probably not a good thing because now black is really running out of moves in this kind of position, so not good for black. Yeah, and here we saw black play king d5, and after king b3, it's really hard to find squares for this knight to move to. Black decided to give the check, but after king c3, he's eventually got to go back to the c4 square to protect this pawn, and now Nakamura has to play like really actively in order to really stay in the game. And we saw e3 played to sacrifice a pawn, open up the e4 square for either of those pieces. So of course Aronian took the pawn, but after knight e4, king b2, we're seeing this knight get to this square to try to take the pawn and leave the pawn here, an isolated pass pawn here for white, making sure that there's not two connected pass pawns. c5, bishop takes a5, knight takes f4. The only problem is this position is just completely done for black. All white has to do is protect the pawn, get the bishop to the f4 square right over here, and then he pretty much just wins the game right away. King a3 getting a tempo, and after the knight moves there, bishop b4 getting another tempo, knight b7, king a4. We saw that black is in zugzwang, has to move the king right over here. If you go to here, I suspect that black is getting really just pushed back. Maybe even you can consider a move like bishop e7. That makes a lot of sense, really. Keep in mind that this knight is just disastrous in this kind of position. Black really has no moves here. Really not. There's no moves in this kind of position for black. Not a single one. That comes in black's dead. So overall, I think really just an unfortunate experience for the bishop and knight. I can really talk from experience that the side with the bishop might not win, but usually it's the case that in this kind of position, if you've got the pass pawns, I'd be extremely careful to play this if I was white. One, because I've got the pass pawn, but also it just tends to be that the bishop can work on one color easier and protect the same things often that are more important in a position. So, yeah, disappointing game for Nakamura, who loses after yesterday's fine win. But I mean, you can't blame Aronian for winning this game. Nakamura blundered with allowing the b5 idea in this position, and especially here, knight e5 was not good. But I think this is a very instructive thing that squares really do matter in chess, and I think Nakamura really underestimated it. So good game, and we'll see game 3 and 4. I think they're having an off day tomorrow, but I'll check. Maybe they're playing tomorrow. Who knows? But anyways, guys, thanks for watching. I appreciate you doing that for me. Aronian wins game 2. Nakamura unfortunately loses. Not unfortunately, but he just lost a very heartbreaking game because he equalized quite easily. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching. See ya.